So hopefully take a few moments there just to record and note down at least 3 things that you're grateful for. If it's more, that's fine. And if you're writing on a piece of paper, or something to bring into the luck journal. And again, attend to any positive feelings that may be associated with that. And what I want to encourage you to do over the next few weeks, and beyond that, if you can, but at least a focus for the next couple of weeks, is to try to do that regularly. Is to take time to pause and note down the things that you're grateful for. It might be, again, the bigger things that you feel as though you're writing down a few times, or it may be something over that last day or so that you feel grateful for, something that's worked well and you feel some sense of gratitude for. In terms of how often to do it, well, the research suggests that maybe doing it every day may not always have the positive impact you want it to. You could try it doing that way, that's fine, and record the experiences you have doing that. At least doing it once a week could be a useful thing to do. And sometimes maybe even pausing to note the things you're grateful for. You don't always have to write it down. The research again suggests taking the time to actually write it down in some way maybe strengthens the effect. So the idea is to try to do it regularly. So that's one thing to focus on for the next couple of weeks. So that's gratitude and luck. And now I want to briefly explore then the possible links between optimism and luck. And again, I see this as part of being this good luck mindset. And I'm related to this idea of expecting good things to happen, because optimism can be regarded in different ways. Now, it may not come as a huge surprise that people who see themselves as lucky will tend to be more optimistic. So some of the research suggests that there's a link between those 2 different aspects. And it's not always clear, well, is it that perceiving yourself to be lucky causes oneself to be optimistic? I feel I'm a lucky person, so therefore I expect things to work out in my favour. Could be one possibility. Another possibility could be that people who are more optimistic therefore tend to perceive themselves to be more lucky. So it's the kind of question that psychologists spend quite a lot of time trying to tease apart. Again, we don't have to concern ourselves too much about that, but at least the idea there seems to be a link between the 2. So is there a way in which maybe by cultivating a more optimistic outlook, could that have an impact upon not just our perceived luckiness, how lucky we perceive ourselves to be, but the actual experiences that we bring about? That's the idea. And therefore, can we learn to become more optimistic? Can we learn to cultivate that kind of outlook? So that's what I want to explore now. And this is where I might feel that this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy could come in. So, could optimism do something, could it have an impact which will help bring about more of those good luck experiences? We'll explore that in terms of what we're calling here a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what it boils down to, is it something we can try to adopt over at least the next couple of weeks, where we try to go into situations with more positive expectations about how those events are going to turn out? So we're particularly referring to events where there's some degree of uncertainty, and often many events have that element to it. Do we have some kind of expectations about how they're going to go? We'll probably have a mixture between how they might go in our favour, they might not go in our favour. Is it possible, but trying to cultivate a slightly more positive expectation, does that have an impact? So essentially it comes down to believing that things will work out for the best. So if this idea of positive expectations feels a little bit too much of terminology, think of it in terms of believing that things will work out for the best. So that's something we can think about. And if that is the case, and if there is something to it, and there is something about a self-fulfilling prophecy about it, it's based on this idea that, well, we might at least acknowledge that our expectations and our beliefs about a certain situation will affect our behaviour. It will affect how we go about doing what it is we need to do. And that could have an impact upon our experiences. And the example I want to kind of briefly mention here is what I hear called the parking angel. And sometimes I describe some of the principles to do with Go Look Yourself and this notion of finding a parking space just when you need one. And that's not to say it comes down to those kinds of trivial events, but I think it captures the essence of some of these ideas. So some people might describe having a parking angel, that they can always find a parking space just when they need one. And whilst I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of being a parking angel, it's not something we're going to explore in detail here, I do think there's a huge part of psychology in that. And I think it's tied up with this idea of being optimistic. So those people that often feel as though they can find a parking space when they need one, often enter the situation believing that they will find a parking space. And one just where they need it to be. And they're even willing to acknowledge that if they find a parking space eventually, then even if it's not as close to where they want to be as they'd like to be, they can still reason it saying, well, that's helpful, I get a slightly longer walk if it's one further away from where I need to be. So there's a way of interpreting how things work out. But often they will say they will find a parking space just next to where they need to go to. And my argument would be, part of it at least, is going to be because they'll have this optimistic outlook. By perceiving as being something that's going to work out in their favour, it may well be they look harder for a parking space, they notice one there when it's there in the first place. If there's one there which they think, oh, is it a bit too tight to get in? Actually, they will try and do it, so it will actually affect their behaviour. Okay? So the idea is taking that notion and applying it to other situations where there's some degree of uncertainty. So that's what I want to encourage you to try over the next couple of weeks. I'm acknowledging there's also other elements of this, and it might not be straightforward as simply, well, if I expect things to work out in my favour, they're going to work out in my favour. I don't expect that to be the case, but does it have some kind of impact? To some extent, you can contrast it with what might be called defensive pessimism. What we like to often do, and there's obviously some benefit to this as well, is if we prepare for the worst, so rather than expect things to go in our favour, some people might describe themselves as being defensive pessimists or realists, another way of describing it. That, well, if I prepare for it not working out in my favour, then if and when it doesn't work out in my favour, I'm prepared for that. I've considered the worst case scenario. And there may well be benefits to that to some degree. So I'm saying there's probably a balance between the two, but I think often we do this without spending time actually, what if we try to go into a situation expecting it's going to go in our favour? So if you find yourself doing some of the defensive pessimism, then at least make a note of that in the luck journal. You know, if you feel as if that actually works better for you in terms of increasing your experiences of luck, or maybe it more helps deal with experiences of bad luck, as and when they happen, so we can return to that. And there's also an area of positive psychology which links to what's called learned optimism. The reason why I've separated that out here from what I described in that previous slide is that it's more linked to how we explain events. So when something's already happened, learned optimism is about how we tend to, well, depending on how things have happened to us and how we explain them, then different people interpret them in different ways. We're going to come back to some of those ideas in that session 5, because these are more linked to how we deal with bad luck events or the negative events. And we want to explore those, but I want to save that for a separate session. So, we now know that hashtag DPhil, just for don't forget your luck journal. These are things I want you to be doing over the next couple of weeks, and beyond if you can, but at least the next couple of weeks. Is with gratitude, you can use your luck journal as a possible gratitude journal, a place where you could note down things that you are grateful for. I'm encouraging you to do that regularly. It doesn't have to be every day, doing it once a week, doing it when you remember to do it. Again, this is something which you volunteer to take part in. Use it in a way which helps you, which you feel is always useful to you. Yes?
Does it matter if it's repeated? So even if on a particular day you feel grateful for something that's happened, but you were grateful a few days ago or the previous week, it's okay if we...
That's absolutely fine, yeah. If you feel grateful for it and that's what you feel, that feeling of gratitude is related to, make a note of it. And again, I would always say with the luck journals, don't necessarily edit yourself. Anything you write down there is going to be helpful. So if it turns out you're doing it and you keep doing it over 6, 7, 8 weeks, but you're still writing the same things, that's absolutely fine. That's really helpful.
I'm extremely grateful.
Well, exactly, yes. And it may well be that over time you might feel as though some of the things you write down change, but that's fine. That's great.
Okay.
So that's part 1. So that's linking to using the luck journal to write down things you're grateful for. In terms of optimism, again, this could be anything you write down in terms of whether or not you feel you're optimistic, how you go about certain events. These are ideas, suggestions to focus that aspect of what you might write in your journal. So first of all, you might note down, well, do you notice how you are approaching events where there's some degree of uncertainty? Do you go into that situation expecting it to go in your favour or expecting the worst? Or somewhere in between? So anything about those elements would be really helpful. And then encouraging you to try this idea of, or when faced with those kinds of events, if you go into that situation and trying to cultivate a gentle expectation that it's going to work out for the best, and record what happens. Does it have an impact? Is there any particular event where actually, because of taking part in this project, I think I'm going to try to be more optimistic about it, expect it's going to go in my favour. Did it have any impact? So, whichever way it works. We're not only interested in the ones where it says, yes, it had an impact. If it doesn't have an impact, then please tell me, please record that. And this touches upon that notion of learned optimism. You can also say a bit about, well, when good or bad events do happen, how do you tend to explain them? How do you attribute causes to those events? Again, these are things we're going to look at in more depth in a later session, particularly when bad events happen to us. So just have a little think about, how do I explain them? Do I tend to explain it in terms of luck? Do I say that was an event that happened, it was pure luck, it was chance? Is there something I did to create that event? Is it something which may happen again in that way or differently? These things we'll explore later. So these are different ways you might just start focusing on this notion of optimism. Particularly if I had to encourage you to do one particular thing, I'm interested in, can you cultivate going into a certain event, expecting it's going to work in your favour, and does that have an impact? Does that bring about a self-fulfilling prophecy, at least in some cases? That essentially brings us to the end of session 2. So thank you again for your attention, and #DFields. Don't forget your luck journal.